Shalom WJC family. It is time for our weekly Torah Talk. This week in Shul, we will be reading Parshat Mishpatim, which is this legal code that appears all of a sudden right after the revelation at Sinai. And we're forced to ask the question, why do we have this mostly civil legal code right after this great apotheosis of the Jewish people at Sinai meeting God face to face and hearing God's words? It seems like an odd turn for the Torah to take, but it is in fact a very meaningful one, and a meaningful one for this very moment. When Rashi, the medieval commentator, who we always turn back to for sort of our first look at the commentaries on weekly Torah portion, when he looks at the beginning of the Parsha, Ve'ela ha-mishpatim asher tasim lefnehem, and these are the laws that you should put before them, he says, what are these doing here right after the Ten Commandments and right after the revelation at Sinai? He says, Ve'ela, and these makes a connection between the former subject of revelation at Sinai and what we're about to hear, which is a civil legal code. And he says that this is to tell us that the Sanhedrin, the legal council of rabbis and judges who are going to adjudicate over the society that the Israelites are going to create in Israel, that Sanhedrin should be located on the Temple Mount. That civil law and religious law not only need equal balance, but need to be linked. Right? In other words, laws are sometimes used in a very inhumane way. Right? That we are so committed to a law that we forget the humanity of the peoples involved in whatever judgment might be coming. We forget that it is not the judge's law that is what we are trying to put forward, the judge's justice, or even the state's justice, but according to the Torah, it's God's justice that's the ultimate justice, a standard higher than any human legislation or judiciary could put forth. And ultimately, the way that we pursue justice in law, in civil legal codes, and in our courts should be reflective of God's attribute of justice, but also Din, also God's attribute of mercy, Rachamim. And Din and Rachamim are always paired together, just like the Sanhedrin should be paired with the temple, which represents sort of the religious revelation of Sinai, but also wrapped right into that has to be the law. It goes even a step farther, as we read in Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin of the Talmud. We are told that it's not just the revelation at Sinai that comes before Ve'ela Mishpatim, but there's one law stuck in between. It's very odd. We're told that you are not supposed to put a chisel to the ramp that's going to lead up to the altar, right? You don't ascend to my altar by steps, and it says it's got to be a ramp. So the question is, what does one have to do with the other? In fact, it goes a little further. He says, and if you make for me an altar of stones, do not build it of hewn stones, right? Where a tool was going to be wielded upon them, and they're going to be treated harshly and broken and pounded. And that's the last law. So we have the revelation at Sinai, then these peculiar laws about the altar and the ramp leading up to the altar, and then Ve'ela Mishpatim. And so in Sanhedrin, he says, why do we have that one law before our civil code? And we are told that by Rabbi Elazar, he says, where can it be derived that the judge should not trample on the heads of people? Because the Torah says, do not ascend my altar by steps. And adjacent to it, it says, and these are the laws. So these two things come next to each other. What is it teaching us? So Rashi explains in his commentary on the Talmud, this is a classic kal v'chomer. Like, if this, then how much more so that? So if we're not supposed to trample on the stones leading up to the altar, we're not supposed to treat them brutally with chisels or whatever it might be, how much more so Should we not disgrace the people who come before us for judgment, who are, in fact, worthy of human dignity? If simple stones, which are inanimate, get this kind of respect, how much more so are people deserving of it? And that is the thing that maybe is most forgotten when it comes to the law, and it comes to our interests. And sometimes we are so committed to ideas or movements that we forget about the human people involved. I think we're seeing a lot of that in the world today. And it's troubling, and it's something we really need to wrestle with. Not that necessarily all these legal efforts are always wrong, and they also need to take into account human dignity and the human beings that are involved. And this is right here in the Torah, pretty close to explicit, that our pursuit of justice, our pursuit of the law, should always be tied to the great principles that are in our Torah. And those principles include human dignity. And doesn't mean we don't pursue the laws, doesn't mean that justice isn't done. That is part of human dignity also, right? It is important to live in a just society, a society with laws that are enforced equitably, equally, as much as possible. So this isn't to say we should always fall on the side of God's rachamim, of God's mercy. It is merciful to everybody to live in a society where there's a legal system. In fact, it's a basic human right. It's in the 7 Noahide laws, the very early laws that apply to all humanity, is that you need to have a justice system so that people have a way to find their safety within a civilization, and to have rights as well as responsibilities. All of that is baked in there. So it's not to say that these are, the teaching then is that we should always land on human dignity and we should never enforce the laws. No, the laws need to be enforced. They need to be enforced equitably, and also taking into account that there's human beings involved, the wronged as well as those who did the wronging. And human dignity is such an important part of the conversation. It just seems to be being missed and left out so much. And perhaps we should take this lesson from Mishpatim to remind us that even as we understand that there are important things that need to happen, sometimes difficult choices that need to be made, that human dignity and the humanity of those involved should always at least be part of the conversation and should be risen up, just like the Sanhedrin sits next to the temple. The religious values from the Torah that teach us to pursue peace and to honor the humanity of all should also be pursued. I hope that we all feel more of that sense of human obligation to each other and sense of human respect infiltrating and permeating our society soon. It certainly seems like we're not quite there yet. Wish you a Shabbat Shalom, a Shabbat full of peace, and hopefully you feel your human dignity and are able to share that with others. Shabbat Shalom.